I want to talk to you today about commercial leases versus residential leases. I'm Tim Blake with Remax Commercial in Grande Prairie, and I'm also a commercial property investor, and I have some residentials as well, so I've kind of seen both sides of it, and I get a lot of the same questions about what the differences are in the leases and the investments, so I just wanted to cover a few today. So one of the major differences is the expenses and who pays for it. So on a residential, typically the landlord pays for all expenses: property tax, insurance, condo fees, repairs. Where on commercial, that gets shifted typically over to the tenant, and the tenant would pay for all that stuff. And if there's an increase in property tax or insurance, as there often is, that would go back to the tenant to pay for. And any repairs, outside of your major structural stuff, your roof, maybe your heat and AC, that would also be paid for by the tenant. So if there's a toilet, they would call their plumber and they'd pay for it versus calling the landlord. So that's as a commercial investor, landlord, that's a nice thing because you're not dealing with as much the little day-to-day stuff. So it could be a little more hands-off. I mean, there's still a lot to do as far as, and a lot to know about how to make sure your investments are running smoothly, but you're not taking as many of those calls. And also, without having to pay for all those little expenses, sometimes your cash flow can be better if you have a good long-term lease in there. And like I said, leases are also typically much longer in commercial. On a residential, 6 to 12 months is pretty typical, or that'd be very short on a commercial. I'm not saying they don't happen, but it's not as common. 3 to 5 year would be pretty common on commercial. Even 10 year if there's a large company, a multinational involved, they like to have really long leases. So with the longer lease, I mean, that can be a plus for both sides. I mean, the landlord knows he's going to have cash flow come in and he knows what it's going to be, so a little more stable, and the tenant knows he can have a spot, and their amounts are fixed. And when I say that, say you have a 5-year lease, doesn't mean your rent is going to be the same over that 5-year term. It may have what you call an escalation clause, where the rent, over time will bump up. Say you're $14 a square foot this year, next year you're at 16, just whatever you both negotiate. And the way that leases are advertised is typically a price per square foot per year. So you might see say $14 a square foot per year is your base rent, but then on top of that you have your triple net expenses, which is your property tax, insurance, all the expenses for the property, and then you add those two together to get your total rent. And when I say triple net expenses, that's just a fancy way of saying the tenant is responsible for all the expenses on the property. And when I'm talking about commercial, I'm basically referring to any non-residential leases. So retail, restaurants, shops, offices, that type of thing is when I say commercial is what I'm referring to. And another major difference is the all the different terms of the lease. So there is no landlord tenancy act for commercial. It basically comes down to contract law and whatever the landlord and tenant negotiate, whatever they're comfortable with. So I've seen 40-page leases, I've seen 2-3-page leases that maybe don't cover as much as they should, and kind of everything in between. So you want to make sure that you work with someone who is experienced in doing commercial leases and can explain all the clauses to you, because there is, especially the longer leases, I mean, you're basically tied into a long time to those terms, and if there's ever any disputes, I mean, it just goes to the lease. Whatever's written in the lease is what settles the dispute. And there's all kinds of different terms you see in them. I mean, sometimes there's personal guarantees, especially for newer businesses. I mean, there's often terms where if you don't pay the rent as the tenant, the landlord can lock you out and basically seize whatever you have in the property for payment of rent. So you want to make sure that you're fully aware of what you're getting into and what your rights and responsibilities are on it. As a landlord, you said you get longer leases, so you do have kind of more fixed cash flow, where you can get, but you also can have much longer times when you're vacant. So the vacancy rate, I mean, leasing Grande Prairie right now is similar in residential versus commercial, but in commercial you can sit a lot longer. 1 or 2 years is not that uncommon to sit on a property. So ideally you'll have more than one unit, so you can kind of spread that vacancy risk over and have good reserves for the time when you at some point you're going to be vacant. I mean, you might go 10 plus years and have it the same tenant there, and life is good, but you also have to prepare for times when you aren't. And like I said, ideally, if you have multiple units, that's a good way to kind of spread your vacancy risk over multiple properties. If you're just starting out, might be a little daunting. But I mean, there is ways. A lot of people will partner with other investors to kind of spread that vacancy risk over, and I do that kind of stuff as well on my deals. So on these, like the terms of the lease, there's so many different things that got to go into it. So just want to make sure you fully understand what your obligations are, because a landlord often won't let you out of your lease in case your situation has changed, or maybe your business is doing as well. You're still stuck to those terms, and the landlord typically will still enforce those, that you're responsible for the lease for the entirety. So subleases are not that uncommon, where the tenant basically at his cost tries to find another tenant to take over his payments basically. And again, it all dictates in the lease whether that's allowable or not. There's renewal terms where you can have terms set where you can renew the lease if you choose, but the amounts may be based on future market rates, and then even the lease might even say how that is determined. So there's lots of different things. My name is Tim Blake, RE/MAX Commercial. I'm happy to help investors with properties, leasing, also tenants who want to get a new space. I'm happy to help them find the space, negotiate the terms. 780-897-8847. If you have any questions or need a spot.